Callum Ashworth was 44 years old, and for most of those years he had operated on one unshakable belief: that anything built properly, a keel, a hull, a marriage, could survive almost any weather, provided the joints were true. He had spent 22 years proving that theory in wood and epoxy at his boatyard on the Dartmouth side of Halifax Harbour. On a Thursday night in late October, standing alone in his shop with the harbour lights blinking through a salt-streaked window and a 19-page separation agreement lying flat on his workbench, he found himself testing that belief against something it had never been asked to hold before. The papers had come from his lawyer that afternoon. Clean, tidy, devastatingly ordinary. All they needed was a signature at the bottom of page 14 and initials on the rest. He had read them twice already, the way he'd read a set of hull specifications, before cutting a single plank, checking for anything that didn't add up, anything he might have missed. Nothing was wrong with the document. That was the problem. It was flawless, and it described the end of 14 years. What made him set the pen down wasn't hope. He wasn't sure, that night, that hope was something he still had access to. It was a text message that lit up his phone at 10:52 p.m., sitting on the bench beside a half-sanded rib of white oak. "Don't forget the Ray Ace's dinner tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Come straight from the yard. We'll go together." That was the whole message. No warmth in it. No punctuation that suggested affection, just the flat efficiency of two people managing a shared calendar. But something in those 17 words, "We'll go together," stopped his hand an inch above the signature line. He turned the papers face down and drove home through a light rain that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to become sleet. He didn't know it then, but in less than 24 hours he would overhear something in a stranger's kitchen that would nearly finish what the papers had started, and then something else entirely, something he hadn't given himself permission to imagine, that would make him put the papers in a drawer and eventually forget the drawer existed at all. If you've ever loved someone so quietly for so long that they started reading your restraint as indifference, stay with this one. It runs closer to home than you'd expect. Halifax in late October carries a particular kind of dampness, the sort that gets into wool coats and doesn't leave until spring. The maples along Yonge Avenue had already turned, and the wind coming off the harbor smelled like the tide was low. Callum had driven the route from his shop to their house in the North End more times than he could count, down Weiss Road, over the McDonald Bridge with the container cranes lit up like something out of a children's book, past the Hydrostone and its neat rows of brick. He knew the bridge's particular sway on windy days. He knew which traffic light on Barrington stuck a beat too long. He'd built a life in this city the way he built boats, by attention, by patience, by trusting that the unglamorous parts, the ribs, the fastenings, the things nobody photographs, were what kept the whole thing afloat. He ran Ashworth and Sons, though there was no son yet, just a hope he and Naomi had once discussed, and then, somewhere in the last 3 years, stopped discussing at all. He restored wooden sailboats, some of them 100 years old, boats that had crossed oceans under sail before either of their grandparents were born. People brought him hulls that everyone else had written off, and he brought them back. It required a particular kind of psychological steadiness, the ability to sit with a problem for months without needing to solve it that afternoon. Colleagues in the trade called him meticulous. His wife in the early years had called it something gentler. She used to say he had unhurried hands. She hadn't said anything like that in a long time. Naomi Ashworth was 41, a creative director at a mid-sized branding agency downtown. The kind of woman who noticed when a room's lighting was doing something unflattering and quietly fixed it before anyone else clocked the problem. She had a talent for making things, spaces, campaigns, dinners, look effortless, when in fact very little about her was effortless at all. She simply preferred people not see the mechanism. They'd met at a mutual friend's Canada Day barbecue on the Northwest Arm, back when Callum still drove a rusted-out Tercel and packed peanut butter sandwiches for lunch on the yard. She'd laughed, really laughed, head back, at something dry he'd said about a client's unrealistic timeline, and he had thought, with the same quiet certainty he applied to a well-cut joint. That's the one. For 9 of their 14 years together, that certainty had never wavered. The last 2.5 had gone quiet in a way that wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people who no longer need to fill silence with noise. It was the other kind. The kind where you say goodnight to someone lying 8 inches away, and the words seem to travel further than that and land somewhere less certain. There's a term psychologists use for what happens in relationships like this: drift. Not a single betrayal, not one catastrophic event, but an accumulation of small, unspoken withdrawals, what researchers sometimes call negative sentiment override, where a person starts interpreting even neutral behavior through a lens of hurt so that everything begins to look like more evidence of the same wound. Callum wouldn't have used that language. He would have said simply that somewhere along the way, he and Naomi had each quietly decided the other wasn't going to meet them halfway, and had each stopped walking. 3 years earlier, the week Callum's biggest restoration contract to date had come through. A 110-year-old schooner hull, a project that would put his name in 3 trade magazines. Naomi had smiled and said, "That's wonderful, love." Her eyes, though, had already drifted to her phone. At the time he told himself she was tired, that the agency had her stretched thin. He told himself a great many things that year, the way a patient man does when he isn't yet ready to name what he's actually looking at. What he hadn't told himself, what he was only beginning to admit, alone in his shop with unsigned papers under his palm, was that the distance hadn't arrived all at once. It had built in small, nearly invisible increments. The 10th anniversary trip to Cape Breton they'd canceled, because she said she was too swamped. The Saturday hikes used to suggest that she started declining without quite saying no. Each surrender was small enough to explain away on its own. Stacked over 2.5 years, they'd formed something with real structural weight. The kind of accumulated stress a beam can carry silently for a long time before anyone notices the sag. He pressed his palm flat against the workbench and thought, wood and steel hold when you understand their limits. People are harder to read. He turned off the shop light, locked the door, and told himself, one more night. One more night to be sure of what I'm looking at. Because what Callum overheard at the Reyeses the next evening was going to unravel everything he believed he understood about his marriage, about his wife, and about how close the two of them had actually come to losing something that, once gone, neither of them could have rebuilt alone. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go further. If your partner came home one night and admitted they'd nearly signed the papers, would you want to know? Or would you rather they'd kept it to themselves? People land on different sides of that. It's worth noticing which side you land on and why. Yolanda Reyes's house sat on a bluff above the northwest arm, one of those South End properties with a view engineered to make you feel, if you weren't careful, either arrived or entirely out of your depth. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water. A dining table set for 10, cloth napkins folded into shape since nobody actually needed, candles that had probably cost more than Callum's first vehicle. Yolanda herself moved through the room in a way that suggested she was performing hospitality as much as offering it. Laughing at the right beats, just a half note too loud, making sure the room registered her success. Callum recognized the type. He'd worked for a few of them. All Finnish carpentry, no framing underneath. He'd left the yard early, as Naomi had asked. She was standing in their bedroom doorway when he got home, already dressed. A deep green wrap dress he remembered complimenting years ago, back when compliments still came easily between them. Her hair was pinned up, soft at the edges. She looked, unexpectedly, fragile. Not sad exactly. More like something held together carefully, by effort alone, the way a boat with a hairline crack in the hull can still look seaworthy from the dock. "You're early," she said, mildly surprised. You asked me to be. Something flickered across her face. Gratitude, maybe, or relief, before she turned to gather her coat. They drove to the South End in silence, the wipers ticking against a light rain. At dinner, surrounded by 4 other couples and a steady rotation of good Nova Scotia wine, everything looked fine on the surface. Callum smiled when it was called for. He answered polite questions about the schooner restoration. He made a dry comment about the McDonald Bridge tolls that got a laugh from the couple across the table. He was present in every observable way. Underneath, though, he was doing what he always did without quite meaning to. Noticing what was settling, what was under tension, what looked solid but might not be. It's a professional habit that doesn't switch off just because you've left the yard. And what he noticed that evening was that Naomi, who had once been the loudest laugh at any table she sat at, had said maybe 15 words in the first hour. She pushed food around her plate. Her hands stayed folded in her lap between bites. When she did laugh, it arrived half a beat late, as though she were listening to the conversation from somewhere just outside it. She caught him watching once. She looked away first. I have become a stranger inside my own marriage, he thought, and the realization moved through him the way cold seawater moves through a wetsuit seam, slowly, and then completely. Around 8:40, he excused himself and walked down the hallway toward the washroom at the back of the house, past framed art he didn't recognize, and a side table with orchids arranged a little too perfectly to be real. Yolanda's home office was the second door on the left, open maybe 3 inches. He heard Naomi's voice first, and stopped. He should have kept walking. A man of his particular temperament doesn't linger in hallways listening to conversations that aren't his. He knew that, even in the moment. But then he heard her crying, not the composed, private crying of someone managing her face for an audience, but the kind that only happens when a person believes no one can hear them. Broken, costly to witness. Yolanda's voice came first, low and careful. Naomi, talk to us. Then his wife's voice. His wife, who hadn't cried in front of him in over 2 years, who had stood dry-eyed at her own father's graveside while people around her fell apart. She said the words that turned Callum completely still in that hallway. Callum is the only person who's ever made me feel safe, and I think I've spent 2 years pushing him away because I was too proud to say I needed him to notice. His hand found the wall. She kept going, her voice fraying the way old rope frays. Not all at once, but strand by strand, at the exact point everyone had been avoiding. 2 winters ago, when her mother had a stroke, Callum had left the yard mid-project, something he never did, and driven her straight to the hospital, sat with her in a hallway for 6 hours without trying to fix anything, without needing her to talk. He'd just stayed. She had never told him what that meant to her. He'd assumed she was simply processing her own way and had gone quietly back to work the next morning because he thought that was what steadiness looked like. I tried to get his attention back, she said, her voice unsteady. I planned things. I made an effort with all of it. And every time, he'd say thank you and go back out to the shop. And I told myself that meant I'd already lost him. In the hallway, Callum closed his eyes. He had noticed every one of those efforts. He had been grateful for every one of them. He had been grateful for every one of them. He had gone back out to the shop because he was chasing a reputation he believed would eventually give them a better, easier life, and not once in 2.5 years had he said that out loud to her. I almost let Trent talk me into something, Naomi said, and her voice dropped low enough that Callum had to lean toward the gap in the door to catch it. He kept saying I was settling, that I deserved more excitement than a guy who smells like sawdust and comes home at 8, that I should just leave and let him show me what an upgrade looks like. A short, hollow sound, not quite a laugh. I was low enough that some part of me almost believed him, but I couldn't go through with it, because Callum builds things that are meant to last 50 years underwater, and I don't know anymore if I deserve someone who builds like that. Callum stood in that hallway a long moment. Trent Delacroix. He knew the name, a property developer who'd been circling Naomi's agency for a rebrand contract, the sort of man who mistakes another person's unhappiness for an opening. He filed the name away with the same calm precision he'd apply to a structural report. Not yet. Later, what occupied the space in his chest right now was something older and heavier. The particular grief of a man realizing that while he'd been trying to build a better life for the people he loved, he'd forgotten to tell any of them that was what he was doing. He had been so focused on the structure he was raising that he hadn't noticed the person standing at its base. Wondering whether she was still included in the drawings, he walked back to the table, sat, poured a glass of water he didn't drink. 20 minutes later, he mentioned an early call with a supplier in Dartmouth. Clean excuse, simple. Naomi nodded, no questions, gathered her coat and followed him to the car. They drove home along the arm in the dark, the water black and glassy on their right, streetlights sliding across the windshield. Naomi watched the road ahead. Callum watched it too, but internally he was reviewing the last 2.5 years the way he'd review a hull with a slow leak, looking for the exact seam where the water had first gotten in. What had he missed, and for how long and why? At home, Naomi went straight to the guest room, her room these past several months. Callum sat at the kitchen table and picked the separation papers back up. He held them a long time. The house hummed with the low sound of the fridge and the wind against the storm windows. The papers felt heavier now, though nothing about them had physically changed. He set them down unsigned and said, To no one should I sign this. Or, he didn't finish the sentence. Stay with me here because at midnight, Callum was about to do something that took more from him than signing those papers ever could have, and Naomi wasn't going to see it coming. At midnight, Callum stood, walked down the hall, and knocked twice on the guest room door. Quiet, measured, the knock of a man who isn't entirely sure of his welcome but has decided to try anyway. A pause, sheets rustling. A lamp clicking on, the door opened. Naomi stood in the threshold in an old university hoodie, hair loose, eyes carrying the particular swelling of someone who's been crying alone for a while. She looked at him the way you look at something unexpected, not with fear exactly, not with hope exactly, but in the narrow, unsteady space between the two. Can we talk? He said. She stepped back and let him in. He sat on the edge of the bed, keeping a deliberate distance, forearms on his knees, eyes on the floor and then on her. Outside, the wind moved through the bare maple in the backyard. In the room, the silence had the particular texture that precedes something important. I heard everything tonight at Yolanda's, he said, his voice rougher than he expected. The office door was open. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard you. The color left her face slowly. Her eyes filled. She pressed a hand over her mouth. I need to tell you something first, he said, steady, despite the weight behind it. I've had a separation agreement sitting in my shop since Tuesday. My lawyer drew it up last week. The tears came without sound. They looked at each other across the small, charged space, and something that had been building silently for 2.5 years cracked open, not a collapse, a release, like a hull, that's been holding pressure past its design limit finally allowed to flex. He reached across the gap between them. She took his hand. They talked for a long time before either of them cried outright, but the crying came eventually. Two adults undone not by anger, but by the particular mixture of grief and relief that arrives when you realize how close you came to something irreversible. I thought you'd already decided to leave, she said. I thought you were just waiting for a clean moment. I thought the same about you, he said. I kept giving you more space because I didn't want to crowd you. I thought that's what you needed. Every time you gave me more space, she said, I read it as proof you didn't want to close the distance. He sat with that. Two people protecting wounds the other hadn't known existed. Two people building the same wall from opposites, each convinced the other had started it. Your mother's stroke, he said quietly. I didn't know what to say. So I just stayed. That was exactly right, she said. I never told you what that meant. I never told you much of anything, because I thought if I had to ask you to choose me, it already meant you hadn't. I chose you every single day, he said. I just never said it where you could hear it. That's the same as not saying it, she said. That landed, and he let it stay. She got up, crossed to the closet, and came back with a shoebox she'd clearly kept somewhere it wouldn't be found by accident. She sat and opened it between them. Letters. His handwriting, younger and looser. The penmanship of a man in his late 20s, still learning how to say what he meant on paper. A handful from the early years. One anniversary note. One with no occasion at all, just something he'd needed to put down before it slipped away. And folded underneath the letters, a gray Dalhousie hoodie he'd assumed was lost years ago in some move. She'd kept it the whole time through the distance, the silence, the months on the guest room bed. I almost threw all of this out last week, she said, barely above a breath. I told myself if he doesn't come to me by Friday, I let it all go. It's Wednesday, Callum said. I know. 2 days. She looked at him. That was the margin. He picked up one of the letters, his own hand, year 4. He remembered writing it at 2 in the morning after a long week, not because anything specific had happened, but because he'd wanted her to know something and hadn't trusted himself to say it out loud. When had he stopped writing things like that? When had saying it started to feel like it needed an occasion? Why didn't we just talk? He said. Not an accusation, genuine sorrow. She gave the small, sad smile of someone who's asked herself the same question for months. Because I was too proud to sound like I was begging, and I think you were too. He nodded. That was exactly true. I don't want to sign those papers, he said. I don't want you to, she answered. Then we do this properly, he said. Not just an agreement to try harder, real work. Someone to help us actually say the things we've been avoiding, instead of using silence as a stand-in for honesty. She searched his face, the old habit of checking whether he meant something before letting herself believe it. He held her gaze and gave her the time she needed. Okay, she said. Not the flat okay of someone going through motions. A real one. Chosen. They stayed up until nearly 2, talking through years 5, 8, 11. The accumulation of small, unsaid things that had eventually become something neither of them could see around. When Callum finally stood to head to bed, Naomi caught his hand briefly. Just that. Just the moment. Just to say I'm still here. But their first session with a therapist would surface something Naomi had been carrying alone for weeks. Something that would test Callum's particular brand of quiet endurance in a way nothing else had. Dr. Beatrice Nwosu's office sat above a bakery in the West End. All soft gray furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The specific stillness of a room designed for people to finally say the true thing instead of the polished one. Callum respected rooms built with intention. He noticed that immediately. They sat close on a soft gray sofa, not quite touching but near enough that the distance felt chosen. Dr. Nwosu had the patient, unhurried manner of someone who'd heard enough rehearsed half-truths to know one on arrival, and who would simply wait, no pressure, no prompting, until the real thing surfaced. Tell me in your own words, she said, what you each believe went wrong. Callum went first. We went quiet around the same time, both of us waiting for the other to speak first. Neither of us did. The longer it went on, the harder it got to start. Dr. Nwosu wrote something down, the kind of note a clinician makes when she recognizes a pattern she's seen before. What researchers call a demand-withdraw dynamic, where one partner's silence reads to the other as rejection, prompting further withdrawal, until both people are protecting themselves from a threat that exists mostly in interpretation. Naomi was quiet a longer moment, looking at her hands at the window, at the pale afternoon light on the floorboards. Then she looked at Dr. Nwosu. There's something I haven't told him yet. She chose her words carefully. A man named Trent Delacroix had called her twice over the past month. He'd told her she was wasting her potential, that staying in a stable marriage was the same as choosing to be stuck, that she deserved a bigger life, more excitement, more of everything. He said I should think about leaving, and let him show me what an upgrade looks like." She paused. "I didn't call him back. That matters to me, that you know I didn't call him back. But I listened to the voicemails twice, and the second time, I didn't delete them as fast as I should have." She held Callum's gaze, not performing remorse, simply carrying the truth the way a person does when they're too tired to hold it alone any longer. Callum looked at his hands. Not anger, not shame, the measured stillness of a man deciding how to respond to something that deserved a real response, not a reflexive one. "Did any part of you want to say yes?" he asked eventually, without accusation. Her eyes filled. "I wanted to feel like someone was choosing me, not him. I never wanted him. I wanted to feel like I mattered, and I hadn't felt that in a long time." "That's fair," Callum said. "I should have made it louder, made it visible." Dr. Nwosu let that settle before speaking. "What I'm hearing from both of you is that you were each craving the same thing, to feel chosen, to feel seen, and neither of you said so out loud. Instead, you each pulled back, and when one partner withdraws without explaining why, the other almost always experiences it as rejection, even when that isn't the intent at all." Neither of them spoke for a moment. The particular silence of people who've just had something named that they've been living inside without being able to articulate it. "Callum," Dr. Nwosu continued, "in the last year, have there been significant decisions you made without discussing them with Naomi?" He reached into his jacket, took out his phone, pulled up an email, and turned the screen toward her. Formal letterhead. A heritage shipyard in Lunenburg had offered him the lead restoration role on a tall ship project, a career-defining commission with a 40% pay increase attached. Naomi's eyes moved down the screen and stopped. "You turned this down." Not a question. His answer was right there in the email thread. Respectful. Final. Dated 3 weeks earlier. "The project needed someone on-site 5 days a week for a year and a half," he said. "I'd have been home maybe 6 nights a month." He took the phone back with a small, final motion. "We were already losing each other under the same roof. I wasn't willing to find out what would happen to us with me gone that much." Naomi stared at him. Several emotions crossed her face at once. Disbelief, grief, something close to reverence. "You gave that up, for us, without telling me?" "I didn't want you carrying guilt over it," he said. "I made a decision I could live with. That was enough for me at the time." She looked like she'd been handed something precious and wasn't sure her hands were steady enough to hold it. Before either could say more, Naomi's phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. She glanced down, went still, then turned the screen and held it out to Callum without a word. A text from Trent Delacroix. "You still have a shot at something better. Don't wait too long." Callum read it once, then again with the same unhurried attention. He'd give a load calculation and set the phone on the low table between them. Then, to the mild surprise of everyone in the room, including himself, he smiled. Not the stiff smile of a man suppressing anger, not a performance for the audience, but a genuine rooted one that didn't need anyone's approval to exist. He put a hand gently on Naomi's shoulder. "That's not a competition I'm in," he said quietly. "Guys like that build for show. I build for load." He looked at her the way he'd look at a set of drawings, taking in the whole structure, not just the one weak corner. "And I'm not finished building this one." Naomi closed her eyes. A single tear moved down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Dr. Nwosu set down her notepad. "I think you've both been trying to love each other in languages the other one couldn't quite hear. The good news is, you're both still here for the translation. That matters more than most people understand." They walked out into a cool West End afternoon, the kind where the October light comes in low and gold and makes ordinary storefronts look worth keeping. They didn't hold hands on the sidewalk, too soon for that kind of ease, but they walked close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and neither of them moved away. In the car, Naomi said quietly, "He's not going to stop." Callum started the engine. "No," he agreed. "He probably isn't. Does that worry you?" He glanced at her, then back at the road. Not even slightly. But Trent's next move, made in public, in front of the exact people whose opinion Naomi had always cared most about, would force her to say something out loud that she hadn't known she was ready to say until the moment it left her mouth. The Maritime Boat Builders Guild held its annual fundraising gala at a yacht club overlooking the harbor, chandeliers and polished brass. The particular energy of a room where Halifax's old money and new money crowds come to be seen admiring each other. Callum wore a charcoal suit. Naomi wore deep navy, understated, entirely herself. They arrived together, walked in together, and when Callum rested his hand briefly at the small of her back as they crossed the threshold, she leaned into it, barely, just slightly, but enough. He noticed. He always noticed the small things that had never stopped being who he was. It felt different from the last 2.5 years. A lot did, now. Trent arrived at 8:20, stepping out of a rented Range Rover, with the plates of a man who'd rented rather than owned it. Callum caught them with a quiet, private amusement, the way a shipwright notices decorative trim painted to look load-bearing. Custom tuxedo, a practiced entrance. Handshakes held a beat too long, eyes darting sideways to confirm who was watching. Callum watched him from across the room and felt something close to pity. Close, not quite. At 9, Trent found Naomi near the bar. Callum was mid-conversation with a colleague across the room, but had a clear line of sight. He watched Trent's easy, practiced lean, the smile calibrated to make a woman feel like the most important person in a crowded room, the small gesture toward the terrace, a private word, away from the noise, away from anyone's husband. Naomi set her glass down. She didn't soften. She didn't hesitate. Her posture straightened, not defensively, not for effect, but with the quiet resolution of a woman who'd already done her reckoning and arrived somewhere firm. She looked at Trent the way you look at something you once briefly considered and then fully set aside. Her voice carried, clear without being loud. I already have a man who spent our whole marriage building something meant to outlast both of us. I'm not interested in anything with a shorter warranty. A brief quiet settled over the nearby conversations, the natural pause that happens when something true is said plainly and without apology. Trent blinked. His practiced smile went briefly offline before the recovery came, smooth on the surface, but the recovery itself told the whole story. He'd walked into that conversation, expecting a particular outcome. Her refusal landed on him like something genuinely foreign. He produced a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and drifted toward the bar. Callum, across the room, had watched all of it. He didn't cross the floor, didn't step in, didn't make a scene. He simply watched Trent's retreating figure the way he'd look at a hull he already knew wasn't going to hold, with the calm recognition of someone who already knows how the story ends. And he smiled, soft and unhurried, the smile of a man who understands the difference between what shines and what actually floats. Later that night, after the gala and the drive home along the darkened harbor, Callum took a different route. Naomi noticed, but said nothing. He drove them to the yard, to the schooner hull he'd spent the year restoring. 110 years of history, sitting under work lights in a corrugated shed near the water. He parked and they got out. The lights threw pale gold across raw planking and half-finished ribs, the honest skeleton of something not yet done but already sound. The harbor glowed faintly in the distance. A foghorn called somewhere past the breakwater. Naomi stood beside him, heels dangling from one hand, feet bare on the cold concrete, looking at the ribs of the hull rising in the half-dark. I didn't build any of this to impress anyone, Callum said quietly. I built it because I wanted to understand how to make something that holds when conditions get bad. He turned to look at her. I want to build the next thing with you, a place that's ours. We choose every part of it together. We do it right, the way we should have been doing everything. She was quiet a moment, the work lights catching something in her expression, not quite tears but close. The look of a woman arriving somewhere she'd stopped believing she'd reach. Then she took his hand, not tentatively, fully, the way a person holds on when they've decided. Tell me where we start, she said. Something shifted in his chest, not a dramatic lift, but a quiet, structural settling, tension releasing from a frame when the last support finally locks into place. He looked at the rising hull around them. "We already did," he said. "Stay with this a little longer," because the moment that came 6 months later, on a dock in Lunenburg on a Saturday morning in May, would turn out to be the quietest, most powerful part of the whole thing. And Trent Delacroix would get exactly one more chance to speak. 6 months on, Callum and Naomi stood together on a public dock in Lunenburg for the christening of the schooner he'd spent over a year bringing back to life. 110-year-old hull now sound in every plank, her original lines restored, her deck the pale gold of freshly oiled fur. It was the biggest restoration of his career, the project he'd once nearly given up his marriage to chase without ever telling his wife why. This time, she'd been part of every decision: the paint color, the brass fittings, the name lettered across the stern. They'd spent the past 6 months in Dr. Nwosu's office weekly at first, then every second week, as the conversations became things they no longer needed coaching through. They'd learned, in the particular language therapists use, to make their bids for connection instead of waiting to be noticed. They'd learned that choosing a marriage isn't a single decision made at an altar, but a smaller one, repeated constantly. In how you listen, in what you say before the silence has a chance to settle back in. In whether you let the other person know what you're building and why. Naomi had started leaving short notes on the kitchen counter before early meetings. Nothing elaborate. "Proud of you for the Lunenburg deadline. Dinner at 7. Come home." He'd kept every one of them in a drawer at the shop. Callum, in turn, had started saying things out loud that he'd previously assumed she already knew. That he'd turned down the tall ship posting for them. That her notes mattered more than she guessed. That the trips she used to suggest and he'd failed to respond to with any real energy were things he'd wanted too, and just hadn't known how to say so. Small things. The right ones. Naomi's mother stood near the gangway, holding a thermos of coffee, having arrived the night before to supervise, as mothers do. The harbor smelled of low tide and fresh paint, when the small crowd of well-wishers had mostly dispersed, and the schooner sat rocking gently at her new mooring. Callum and Naomi climbed aboard alone and stood at the stern rail, looking back at the town rising in tiers of saltbox houses behind them. "I almost walked away from all of this," Callum said, "because I stopped listening. I was so focused on building something for us that I forgot to include you in the drawings." He looked out at the water. "Good thing the foundation was strong enough to hold while we figured that out." She reached over and took his hand. "We built the foundation, both of us. You didn't do that alone." He turned and looked at her fully, without the careful guardedness that had settled over him during the lost years. He looked at the woman who'd kept his old letters in a shoebox, who'd folded a worn gray hoodie carefully underneath them, and held onto it through 2.5 years of silence and doubt, who had stood straight in a crowded room and told a man in a rented tuxedo that she wasn't interested in anything with a shorter warranty, who had sketched out the layout of their future kitchen on a napkin one night and fallen asleep at the table still holding the pen. "No," he said softly, "I didn't." Then Naomi's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She glanced down. A text from Trent, one final time, as if some part of the universe wanted the story to have proper punctuation. "You still have a shot at something better. Don't wait too long." She read it once. She didn't show it to Callum first, didn't announce it, didn't ask what to do. She simply blocked the number, quietly, without ceremony. The way you close a window once the weather has changed and there's no longer any reason to leave it open. Then she handed the phone to him anyway, wordlessly, the way people who've been married a long time share small things without needing to explain them. He read the screen, saw the blocked contact, saw the empty thread where nothing more would ever arrive. He handed it back. No anger, no satisfaction pulled from someone else's smallness. Just a kind of uncomplicated peace, The sort that comes when bitterness has nothing left to attach itself to, because you're too fully occupied with the life directly in front of you. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, and they stood that way a long time, watching a harbor they'd both known their whole lives from the deck of something they'd finally, properly, built together. What tends to get lost in stories like this is how ordinary the turning points actually were. Not one grand gesture, but a knock on a door at midnight. Not a single confession, but a slow accumulation of small, honest sentences, said out loud instead of assumed. The clinical term for what nearly broke them is straightforward enough. Two people caught in a cycle of protective withdrawal. Each one's silence read by the other as proof of the very abandonment they were both afraid of causing. What saved them was just as unglamorous. The decision, made twice, by two different people, on two different nights, to stop protecting themselves and start telling the truth instead. Naomi stayed on the deck a while longer after Callum went below to check the mooring lines, watching the lights come on one by one along the shore, and thought, not for the first time that year, that some of the most important repairs in a marriage happen in places completely invisible to everyone standing on the dock.